Hey Al, welcome back. Hope everyone's doing well today. We've got into our next section of the textbook, and that is markets and welfare. And in this chapter, we're really going to talk about what's the general, what are we trying to maximize in markets? How are we trying to maximize it? What policies influence this? Like, we've talked about markets, but like, why are we interested in them? And what are the tools required for us to understand whether or not a policy is good or bad outside of just price changes? So to this end, we're going to work through chapters 7, 8, and 9, and this is really going to introduce us to the concept of surplus. And that's our key measurement of welfare. And so in particular, this chapter 7, is going to be about producers and the efficiency of markets. Apologies for my little Tasmanian devil voice there. Oh, right. So let's just kick off. Economics policy focuses on increasing welfare at its core, whether it's individual firms, whether it's individuals, or whether it's countries as a whole. And this comes down to positive analysis with normative goals. So remember, we talked about this in chapter 2. What's positive economics? That's testable statements which express an idea of how economics functions. Think of law and demand. The law of demand, right, tells us that as price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. That's a positive statement. That's testable. That's verifiable. Next, though, we have normative economics. And in normative economics, we have things like statements of aims, desires, way the world should be. This is what we would love to channel our policy into. So welfare economics is a study of how the allocation of resources affects economics well-being. Then the first concept we're going to talk about is consumer surplus. And where we get the idea of consumer surplus is, first off, let's think about willingness to pay for something. And this is basically the maximum amount that a pay for a good. So, and this will date this video. Right now, what is about to come out this holiday season is the new generation of video game consoles. So Xbox is releasing the Xbox Series X and S, and PlayStation is releasing the PS5. And these goods are priced at $500 and $400. And this is something that a lot of people are really excited about. There's people that are like, I absolutely want one from the get-go, no matter what. And there are other people, particularly say parents, that are thinking of these as gifts. They're like, I don't know, like maybe it's too expensive. Like I get people, but like, what is it? So to that end, there is a willingness to pay for these items, right? You have your hardcore gamer that's like, I would pay $800 for it starting day. And then you have your families and parents that are just like, I mean, if I could get it for like 300, I don't know, 400, 500 seems like a bit much. Like, this is like a discussion of how people are willing or what they're willing to pay for the item. Consumer surplus is basically the amount. Let me get my little pointer up here. The consumer surplus is basically the amount a buyer is willing to pay for a good minus the amount the buyer actually pays for it. So at the end of the day, for example, with the video game consoles, there were probably people willing to pay $800 to $1,000 for the newest, latest console because they're just gamers and like love it and they're like so excited. At the end of the day, the actual price for the Xbox Series X and the PS5 is $500. And so for people that were willing to pay more than $500, their consumer surplus is the difference between the fact that we're willing to pay 800, 900, 600, and they only pay 500. And so the difference between that, so for example, if this individual was like, I was willing to pay 700 for it, their consumer surplus was $200. That was their willingness to pay minus the amount paid for it. Graphically, this is going to look like the region below the demand curve and above the price. And I want you to note here that the demand curve tells us how much everyone is willing to pay at any given price. So clearly there are people willing to pay for a good above the price point, and they don't have to. They only pay the market price. Another example, think about iPhones. Some people are willing to pay astronomically high for an iPhone, but at the end of the day, anyone buying an iPhone just pays the market cost. So to be clear, what this looks like is something like this. So let's see if we can zoom in here. This is an example of the price of an album, and the people buying this album are John, Paul, George, and Ringo. So apparently the Beatles have grown up and they're wondering whether or not they want to buy this album. And so let's just think about, first off, let's establish what our price of the album is. The price of the album is $70, and you can see this line here that tells us the price of the album is $70. The quantity of albums is determined by our demand curve. In this case, our demand curve is a little staggered because we only have 4 individuals. We have John, Paul, George, and Ringo. At a price of $70, well, let's before we get into this, let's look at the willingness to pay for John, Paul, George, and Ringo. So John's willing to pay $100 for the album. Paul's willing to pay $80 for the album. George is willing to pay $70 on the dot for the album. And Ringo is willing to pay $50 for the album. Now, what this tells us is at the end of the day, if the price is, so our example here is the price is $70.01. So the price is $70.01. What we can see over here is that since John was willing to pay $100 and the price is $70.01, John decides to buy the album. So we sell at least one at $70.01. So John buys, and his consumer surplus is roughly $30. Paul, meanwhile, buys at $80. So he's willing to pay $80, and it's only $70.01. So he buys it, and he basically has a consumer surplus of $10. George, though, his willingness to buy was $70. Since the price is $70.01, we basically say this is too high, and George does not buy. And of course, for Ringo at $50, he absolutely doesn't buy because he's just like, nope, this isn't worth it to me. This is way too much. So, for example, there will be people that look at the price of the new consoles and they're just like $500. No, I have better things to do with that money. And those people won't buy. But for the individuals above that and participating in the market, that will be out of the consumer surplus. So if we're wondering what the total market or the total consumer surplus is in this case, what we'll do is we'll look at John's consumer surplus 30, Paul's consumer surplus 10, add those together, and so we get 30 plus 10 equals 40. So our total consumer surplus in the market for this album is 40. And just over here, let's look at this. I want to pause and make sure you have this. This is a simple calculation. All we're doing is we're calculating the area above the price and below the demand curve, and that equals our consumer surplus. If the curve is steps like we did over here, it's just as easy as calculating the area of a standard rectangle. So this was $80 was willingness to pay. One purchase was bought. 80 minus 70 is 10. So yeah, the area of that is just 10. And some area for Paul or for John is 30. If the demand is a line, you'll have to have a triangular consumer surplus. So use the area of a triangle. And this equation is 0.5 times base times height. So find the base, the height, the length, and the width by using the y and x axes. And so that's how you will do this. So this is our x-axis, the quantity of albums, and the y-axis is the price of the albums. This is another example. So first off, in panel A, we have the price of a good at $80 and the consumer surplus is 20. And we'll see why in a moment. And then panel B, the price of the good is $70 and the consumer surplus will increase to 40. Now, in this example, we're still looking at the market for albums. The only difference is we have changed our buyers. So in this case, we have Taylor and I don't get the other information for our other buyers, but we have Taylor and Carrie at least. And so at $100, the price is 80. All we're doing is we're calculating the area for Taylor, and hers is $100 minus 80, so she has a consumer surplus of $20. But if the price drops, that's what the second graph is really telling us. You can increase the consumer surplus by a price drop. Why? 2 reasons. First off, Taylor was paying, willing to pay $100. She was paying 80, but now she's only paying 70. So first off, by dropping the price, you increase the original consumer surplus from Taylor, who was purchasing then. Additionally, though, we now get Carrie's surplus. So Carrie's entered the market and purchased. She was buying at 80. Now that it's $70, she gets a surplus of 10. So the 2 ways that consumer surplus increases, and we'll see this in a second. Ooh, skipped ahead. So how does consumer surplus increase? 2 reasons. 1, more consumers involved at lower prices, i.e. we have the benefits of trade, which means more consumer surplus. 2, those that are willing to pay at higher prices are now paying a lower price, therefore increasing their consumer surplus. So what is the significance of consumer surplus? Really, It's an analytical tool that allows us to analyze the desirability of certain outcomes to certain groups. So let's look at the price and consumer surplus. When we have a straight line, this is going to be our third example. Typically, the demand curves we get are straight lines, right, with a flat slope. So our consumer surplus, if the price is right here at P1, our consumer surplus is the quantity sold, so quantity 1, times the price, the difference between the willingness to pay minus the price. In this case, our willingness to pay is marked by our demand curve. So we want to calculate the area of this triangle. And what we would do is you'll do A minus P1, the price we're actually paying, and that difference tells us the height of our consumer surplus. We multiply it by the quantity of our surplus, or the quantity, and then we multiply it by 1/2 since it's a triangle. So to be clear, the calculation for consumer surplus equals 1/2, since it's a triangle, times demand times A minus price. Parentheses, so we know that those two go together. So 1/2 times the difference between A and P, and times the quantity in the marketplace. So that's how you'll calculate your consumer surplus. Now, to be clear, consumer surplus can increase. And just to show you how it increases, let's look at the second. This is a consumer surplus at price P2. So basically what we see here is we see that our price has decreased from P1 to P2. And with that price decrease, what happens is now everyone that was buying the good at the initial price of P1, they're now saving the difference between P1 and P2. So they get this additional consumer surplus to the initial consumer surplus. So this light blue area here. However, we also increase the quantity sold with these new consumers. So we move from Q1 to Q2. And so this is E to F, and this gets us there. And so this is our additional benefit. So now if you wanted to calculate how much did consumer surplus increase, two ways to do it. First, you could calculate the area of the additional consumer surplus to initial customers plus the area of the consumer surplus to new customers. And that would just be the difference between P1 and P2 times the quantity 2 and times 1/2, and that gets you the area. Or we could calculate the difference between A and P2 times quantity 2 and multiply it by 1/2 again and subtract the original. So those are just two different ways to calculate the new consumer surplus from this change. So like consumers, producers also get surpluses. Theirs, though, is the difference between their cost, which is the willingness to sell. So the cost is the value of everything a seller must give up to produce a good. Now, just a reminder, in economics, we consider opportunity cost. And so even though our cost curve factors in that they want a profit as well, the producer surplus then is the amount a seller is paid for a good minus the seller's of providing it. And basically what it'll look like it is the triangle above the supply curve and below the price. And we'll see in a second. So calculating the producer surplus is the exact same as consumer surplus, almost. The only difference is, again, we're looking at the area below the price and above the supply curve, i.e. the producer surplus. So how do you increase producer surplus? Higher prices. That's easy enough. Those that are willing to sell at lower prices receive even more money now, and now there are more suppliers. So combined, what this looks like is we have the consumer surplus is our area, our red area here, and our producer surplus is the blue area. And simply put, to calculate the area of both, since they're both triangles, just find the difference between their points and the price. So producer surplus is even easier, right? Because the height is just the price times the quantity times 1/2. The consumer surplus, we had to calculate out its height. So this gets us to the idea of market efficiency. And market efficiency really gets at the concept of what we consider a benevolent social planner. And the idea is a benevolent social planner wants to maximize everybody's welfare. He wants to maximize, or she wants to maximize the total welfare in the market. And so to do this, you calculate the total surplus, and the total surplus is simply our consumer surplus plus our producer surplus. And again, the consumer surplus is the value to buyers, i.e., their willingness to pay, minus the amount paid to buyers, while the producer surplus is the amount received by sellers, the cost of sellers. So real quick to come back, the total surplus is just the sum of this entire area there. So that's it. That entire area equals our consumer surplus. Now, the problem facing the benevolent social planner and anyone interested in market efficiency is there is a tension between efficiency, which is the property of how allocating resources to maximize total surplus received by everyone in society, versus equality, which that's the question of how much do we distribute our resources over on in the economy. These are our core key questions. And the two are in tension with one another, and you'll see why in later chapters particularly. So how do we evaluate market in equilibrium? What we find is that free markets allocate the supply of goods to the buyers who value them most highly, as measured by their willingness to pay. And I want to add a critique here. Willingness to pay is informed by ability to pay. So for example, there are true car enthusiasts who might really love to own a Ferrari, but just do not have the cash to buy a Ferrari. Doesn't matter how much they value the car or if they had the money, how much they'd pay for it. But the fact that you don't have that money means that you can't access it. Still, the market separates who owns goods based upon that price and people's ability to willingness to buy it at that price and ability to buy it at that price. So free markets allocate the demand for goods to the sellers who can produce them at the lowest cost. This is the next thing, is it's the people that can produce this for the cheapest amount possible or with the lowest cost ultimately overall. Those are the groups that are the suppliers. Free markets, meanwhile, produce the quantity of goods that maximize the sum of consumer and producer surplus. And attempts by a planner, even a benevolent one, has a tendency to decrease and diminish the total market surplus. One last thing to finish this chapter. Whoop, not that far ahead. Let's see if we'll go back here. All right, one last thing to finish this chapter. Market efficiency and market failure. This chapter captures the basic welfare economics through notions of consumer and surplus and producer surplus, but unregulated markets don't necessarily work out this neatly always. And there's two of many reasons why. The first off is market power. A few agents can disproportionately gain influence over market prices. And we'll talk about this in later chapters in this course. Secondly, market failure. This is the inability of some unregulated markets to allocate resources efficiently. Examples here are industries where the technology and inputs have not caught up to the product. An example, Uber's yet to make a profit. So this is just to kind of leave you in mind of what we're gearing up to explore in chapters 8 and 9. Anyways, I hope you've enjoyed this. As always, if you need something, don't hesitate to reach out. Take care, folks. And till next time, see you then.